Hey, welcome in. Let the day fade out, and we'll ease into a quiet story from ancient Rome. In Rome, superstition did not begin with fear. It began with attention. A Roman did not wake in the morning wondering whether the gods existed. That question had already been settled. The real concern was subtler and more persistent. Were the gods satisfied right now? Had something been missed, misunderstood, or done slightly wrong? To a Roman, the world was crowded with awareness. Streets, rooftops, thresholds, and crossroads were not neutral spaces. They were places where divine forces might notice you or take offense. A creaking door, a flickering lamp, a sudden shout from the alley could all carry meaning. Not always, but possibly. And that possibility was enough to shape behavior. Modern language collapses Roman belief into a single word: superstition. To the Romans themselves, the situation was more precise. They drew a line, at least in theory, between religio and superstitio. Religio was correct observance, performing rites properly, honoring agreements with the gods, maintaining the balance that kept the city stable. Superstitio, by contrast, suggested excess, too much fear, too much obsession, a kind of anxious overreaction to divine signs. In practice, that line was blurry. What one Roman dismissed as needless anxiety, another experienced as simple caution. The same behavior could be praised in a crisis and mocked in calmer times. What mattered was not whether signs existed, but how seriously one took them. Rome was built on the idea that divine favor determined success. Victories, harvests, public order, and even weather were understood as outcomes of the relationship between humans and gods. This relationship was not emotional or confessional. It was contractual. Romans spoke of the pax deorum, the peace of the gods, as something that had to be maintained through careful action. When things went wrong, it was assumed that the peace had been disturbed. That assumption created a culture of constant monitoring. The sky was watched. Animals were watched. Words were watched. Even accidents were watched. A stumble on the doorstep could feel unsettling, not because it hurt, but because it happened at a moment of transition. Romans were deeply sensitive to beginnings, the start of a journey, the opening words of a speech, the first sound heard after leaving home. These moments felt exposed, as if fate leaned closer then. Superstition, in this environment, was not a fringe behavior. It was a background hum. It shaped when people traveled, how they spoke, and what they avoided saying aloud. Certain words were softened or replaced. Certain names were spoken carefully. Praise was deflected, especially toward children, because attention itself could invite harm. Unlike modern superstition, Roman belief was not mainly about luck. It was about offense. Bad outcomes were rarely random. They were messages, corrections, or consequences. A failed business deal might suggest neglected rights. A sudden illness could hint at an unseen imbalance. Even personal misfortune carried a public dimension, because one person's mistake might draw divine displeasure onto family or neighborhood. This is why Roman superstition cannot be separated from daily life. It lived in kitchens and courtyards, not just temples. It influenced how bread was broken, how lamps were lit, how offerings were poured. It appeared in small gestures, touching the doorway before leaving, murmuring a phrase when something unexpected happened, spitting lightly to avert attention. The Romans were not naive about this. Writers complained about excessive fear. Philosophers mocked people who trembled at every sound. Politicians accused rivals of manipulating signs for personal gain. Yet even the skeptics lived within the same framework. They still observed rituals. They still avoided certain days. They still spoke carefully during moments that felt exposed. Superstition also carried social meaning. To be seen as careless with the gods was dangerous. It suggested recklessness, arrogance, or ignorance. At the same time, to appear overly fearful could invite ridicule. The ideal Roman was attentive but controlled, aware of signs, but not paralyzed by them. This balance was never stable. During times of war, plague, or famine, anxiety surged. Practices that once seemed excessive became reasonable. Old rites were revived. New gods were consulted. When stability returned, the same behaviors might be dismissed as embarrassing relics of panic. What is important to understand is that Roman superstition was not a collection of isolated beliefs. It was a system of interpretation. It trained people to look for meaning, especially when things went wrong. It offered explanations that reduced uncertainty, even as it created new anxieties. To walk through Rome was to move through layers of expectation. Shrines at street corners watched passers-by. Household altars glowed in the dim light of atriums. Public spaces echoed with remembered signs, places where lightning had struck, where a bird once cried at the wrong moment, where a statue had wept or turned. The Roman world was not silent, it murmured constantly, and superstition was how Romans listened. This listening moved close to the ground, away from abstract ideas and into homes, streets, bedrooms, marketplaces, and graveyards. The beliefs were not distant theories, they were habits. And habits, repeated across generations, shaped how Rome understood safety, danger, and the unseen forces woven into ordinary life. The Roman home was never just a shelter. It was a boundary, a threshold between what was known and what might intrude. Romans believed danger did not always arrive loudly. More often, it slipped in quietly, through neglect, carelessness, or a forgotten gesture. Because of this, the house itself became a landscape of constant attention. Every Roman home, whether a cramped apartment or a spacious domus, was understood as inhabited by unseen presences. Some were protective, others were neutral but watchful. None were to be ignored. The household was not a private space in the modern sense. It was a small religious ecosystem balanced through routine. At the center of this ecosystem were the household spirits. The Lares were guardians of place, tied to the physical home and its continuity. The Penates watched over food and storage, ensuring that nourishment remained available. The genius of the male head of household and the Juno of the woman represented personal life force, protection, and fertility. These were not abstract gods. They were addressed daily, often casually, but never carelessly. The hearth was the emotional and spiritual core of the home. Fire meant warmth, cooking, light, and continuity. Letting the hearth fire die unintentionally could feel ominous. It suggested neglect, disorder, or a lapse in attention that might ripple outward. Rekindling it was not just practical, it was corrective. Doorways carried particular weight. A threshold marked transition, and transitions were vulnerable moments. Romans were careful about how they crossed them. Tripping while leaving the house could unsettle a person for the rest of the day. Some paused briefly before stepping out, grounding themselves, acknowledging the space they were leaving and the uncertainty ahead. Objects near the entrance were often chosen deliberately. Small shrines, protective symbols, or worn charms might be placed where they could quietly do their work. These were not decorations, they were precautions. Daily routines reinforced this protective atmosphere. Lamps were lit with intention. Offerings, even if modest, a pinch of grain, a splash of wine, were made regularly. Not because disaster was expected, but because consistency itself was believed to maintain order. Speech inside the home mattered. Certain words were avoided, especially during meals or at the start of the day. Sudden loud talk, harsh criticism, or expressions of despair could feel dangerous, as if they might attract attention from forces better left uninterested. Parents often softened praise for children, deflecting it with humor or ritual phrases, to avoid drawing envy or harm. The household calendar added another layer of caution. Some days were considered favorable for beginnings, others were approached carefully. Moving furniture, starting a journey, or making major decisions on the wrong day could create unease. even if nothing immediately went wrong. The discomfort itself was part of the belief. Anxiety was a signal that balance might be off. Even cleanliness had a superstitious edge. Disorder was more than unattractive. It could invite trouble. Sweeping was not done carelessly or at improper times. Waste was removed thoughtfully. Spilled substances, especially salt or wine, were not ignored. How one reacted to the spill mattered as much as the spill itself. Children grew up absorbing these habits without formal instruction. They watched adults touch thresholds, mutter brief phrases, correct small mistakes with quiet gestures. Over time, these actions became instinctive. Superstition was not taught as doctrine, it was learned as muscle memory. Night changed the tone of the house. Sounds felt sharper, shadows seemed more active, lamps burned longer. Certain tasks were avoided after dark. The home was still protective, but its boundaries felt thinner. People moved more quietly, spoke less, and paid closer attention to anything out of place. Importantly, none of this required constant fear. Roman superstition in the home was preventative, not panicked. It was about maintaining a sense of normality that kept danger distant. Trouble came, they believed, when routines were broken, not dramatically, but subtly. This focus on the home explains why Roman superstition endured across centuries. Empires changed, politics shifted, but the household remained the first line of defense against uncertainty. The habits practiced there followed Romans wherever they went, into military camps, rented rooms, and distant provinces. The house was where belief became habit, and habit, repeated every day, became safety. In Roman life, danger did not always come from the gods. Sometimes it came from other people, not through violence or theft, but through attention. Romans believed that being noticed too intensely, especially with envy or resentment, could cause real harm. This fear was not abstract. It was rooted in the realities of dense cities, sharp social hierarchies, and fragile success. When fortunes could rise or fall quickly, envy felt like a force that needed managing. This belief crystallized into what modern language calls the evil eye. Romans did not always give it a single name, but they understood the idea clearly. A look, a thought, or a spoken remark charged with jealousy could damage health, luck, or stability. The danger lay not only in hostile intent, but in admiration that lingered too long. Because of this, Roman superstition developed an entire defensive vocabulary. It was not aggressive, it was preventative. The goal was not to punish envy, but to redirect it. Apotropaic practices, actions meant to turn harm away, were everywhere. Some were obvious, others were subtle enough to pass unnoticed by outsiders. A gesture made during conversation, a charm worn beneath clothing, a symbol etched casually onto a wall or tool. The most striking of these symbols was the fascinum. To modern eyes, it looks crude or humorous. To Romans, it was protective. The symbol drew attention to itself, absorbing harmful focus and deflecting it away from the person or place it guarded. This is why it appears on jewelry, doorways, military standards, and household items. It was not decoration, it was distraction. Children were considered especially vulnerable. Their health was uncertain, their future unformed, and their beauty or strength could provoke envy without malice. Roman families responded with visible protection. Boys wore bullae, rounded amulets, until adulthood. Girls wore lunulae, crescent-shaped charms tied to fertility and protection. These objects signaled that the child was guarded, watched, and not an easy target. Adults used quieter methods. Compliments were deflected quickly. A parent might downplay a child's intelligence or strength, not out of modesty, but caution. Success was spoken of carefully. Even happiness could feel risky if displayed too openly. Gestures mattered. A quick motion of the hand, a touch to an amulet, a brief phrase spoken under the breath. These actions were not dramatic. They were practiced until they felt automatic. allowing a Roman to move through social situations without appearing fearful. Spoken language itself became defensive. Romans avoided direct statements that might tempt fate or draw attention. Instead of declaring confidence, they softened claims. Instead of predicting success, they acknowledged uncertainty. Words were shaped to reduce exposure. Class and status influenced how these beliefs were expressed. The wealthy could afford elaborate charms, engraved gemstones, and symbolic artwork. The poor relied more on gestures, phrases, and small, portable objects. But the underlying concern was the same. Public spaces heightened the risk. Markets, baths, festivals, anywhere crowds gathered, were places where eyes lingered. Romans were aware of how they appeared. Clothing, posture, and even silence could function as protection. Standing out too much invited attention. Standing out too little invited suspicion. This fear of envy also shaped reactions to misfortune. Sudden illness, unexplained loss, or repeated bad luck might be interpreted not as coincidence, but as the result of being noticed at the wrong time. The question was not who did it, but how to prevent it from continuing. Countermeasures followed. Additional charms were worn, routines were tightened. Behavior became more restrained. The solution was rarely confrontation. Instead, it was quiet correction. Importantly, Romans did not see this as irrational fear. Envy was understood as a real social force, capable of destabilizing relationships and communities. Superstition provided a way to acknowledge that danger without accusing anyone directly. The evil eye belief also reinforced social norms. Excessive pride was discouraged. Public boasting was risky. Moderation was safer, not just morally, but practically. Through these habits, Romans navigated a crowded world, one where success was visible, privacy was rare, and attention itself carried weight. Superstition offered tools for survival in that environment. Protection, in this sense, was not about hiding. It was about balance, being seen, but not too clearly, noticed, but not fixed upon. In a society built on reputation, superstition became a way to manage the invisible pressures that reputation created. For Romans, action without permission was dangerous. Before important decisions, they wanted to know whether the gods approved. Not hoped, not guessed, approved. This distinction mattered. Hope was human. Approval was divine. Acting without it felt like stepping forward blindfolded, trusting chance rather than order. This need shaped public life, private choices, and even moments that appeared spontaneous. Romans did not believe the gods spoke continuously. They believed the gods spoke when asked, and only when asked correctly. That belief created a culture of attention rather than constant revelation. The burden was on humans to notice, interpret, and respond properly. The most formal way of seeking approval was through auspices, the observation of signs, especially from birds and the sky. The logic was simple and widely understood. The gods controlled nature. Nature revealed their will. Humans, if attentive and disciplined, could read it. This practice did not belong only to priests. While specialists existed and held authority, the underlying mindset was widespread. Romans learned early that timing mattered. Acting at the wrong moment could invalidate even the best plan. A sound decision made at the wrong time was still dangerous. Birds were especially important because they moved freely between earth and sky. Their flight patterns, calls, and directions were watched closely. A bird appearing on the right or left, calling at the wrong time, or behaving unusually could stop an action cold. Silence, too, could feel significant. The absence of a sign could be as unsettling as a negative one. Public officials were expected to consult signs before major events. Assemblies, elections, and military movements were rarely begun without some acknowledgement of divine permission. A favorable sign allowed proceedings to continue with confidence. An unfavorable one could justify delay, cancellation, or reconsideration, even when the human reasons for action were strong. This gave superstition real power. A bad omen did not just cause fear. It produced consequences. Meetings dissolved. Votes were postponed. Armies waited. Sometimes this reflected sincere caution. Sometimes it provided a convenient pause. Both possibilities were accepted as part of the system. Romans were aware of this ambiguity. Accusations of manipulating signs were common in political life. A rival might be blamed for inventing an omen to block legislation or disrupt a vote. Yet even these accusations accepted the underlying premise: signs mattered. You could argue about interpretation, not relevance. Beyond official rituals, everyday omens shaped behavior quietly but persistently. Chance encounters felt meaningful, meeting a particular person at the wrong moment, hearing a word that echoed a feared outcome, seeing an animal behave oddly as one stepped outside. These moments lingered, not because they were clear, but because they felt charged. Words themselves could become omens. An accidental phrase spoken during a serious discussion might unsettle everyone present. The meaning was not always clear, but discomfort alone was enough to justify caution. Romans trusted unease. It was treated as information rather than emotion. Travel sharpened this sensitivity. Leaving home was risky. Roads were unpredictable. Ships were fragile. A poor sign before departure could suggest turning back or delaying. Some travelers paused deliberately at the doorway, listening for the first sound outside. That sound, however ordinary, might shape expectations for the entire journey. Military life amplified everything. Soldiers watched birds, clouds, and sudden movements with heightened attention. A shout, a stumble, or a dropped object before battle could spread anxiety quickly. Commanders worked to control interpretation, but belief was difficult to suppress once fear took hold. Not all omens were external. Dreams could also be read as signals. While not always trusted, a disturbing dream before an important action might prompt consultation or delay. Ignoring such warnings felt reckless, as though one were rejecting offered guidance. Importantly, unfavorable signs did not always mean abandonment. Sometimes they meant adjustment. A different route, a different day, a different speaker. The goal was alignment, not paralysis. Romans did not expect perfection, but responsiveness. This constant attention trained Romans to read the world as responsive rather than random. Events were not isolated. They were connected through timing and meaning. When something went wrong, the first question was not how, but why now. Critics existed. Philosophers argued that excessive attention to signs undermined reason and invited manipulation. Yet even they struggled to escape the habit. In moments of uncertainty, reason alone felt thin. Signs offered reassurance, even when unclear. Auspices and omens created a shared language. Everyone understood what it meant to pause, to reconsider, to wait for a better moment. Superstition provided a socially acceptable way to delay action without admitting fear or weakness. In this way, belief did not slow Roman life, it structured it. It imposed rhythm, restraint, and a sense of dialogue with forces beyond human control. Romans did not expect certainty, they expected guidance. And they believed the world, if watched carefully, would provide it. Some signs were too serious to ignore. When the ordinary language of omens felt insufficient, Romans turned to more technical forms of interpretation. These methods carried weight because they claimed precision. They did not rely on fleeting impressions or personal unease. They promised structure in moments when disorder felt close. One of the most respected practices was haruspicy, the reading of entrails, especially the liver after sacrifice. To modern eyes, the practice seems grim. To Romans, it was diagnostic. The gods had been asked a direct question, and the body of the offering held the answer. Haruspices were specialists. Many traced their authority to older traditions, especially Etruscan knowledge, which Romans regarded as ancient and exacting. Their expertise was not mystical improvisation. It was technical, memorized, and rule-bound. Specific markings, shapes, discolorations, or irregularities carried defined meanings. The liver mattered most because it was believed to mirror the structure of the cosmos. Divided conceptually into regions associated with different divine forces, it became a map rather than a symbol. A flaw in one section did not mean general displeasure. It pointed to a particular concern. This precision made haruspicy attractive during uncertainty. Leaders wanted clarity. Was the danger military, political, environmental, or internal? The reading did not always give comfort, but it gave direction. Lightning and thunder occupied a similar category of seriousness. Unlike birds or chance words, lightning felt unmistakably divine. It was sudden, violent, and impossible to ignore. A lightning strike did not merely frighten, it contaminated. When lightning struck a place, Romans believed the area became ritually dangerous. Activity might be halted, the ground could be marked. Specialists were consulted to determine what had been offended and how balance could be restored. Until then, proceeding as normal felt reckless. Prodigies extended this sense of alarm. These were events that seemed to break the expected order of the world. Animals born malformed, crops behaving unnaturally, statues sweating, bleeding, or turning without cause, rivers flowing backward. The stranger the event, the stronger the signal. Prodigies were rarely interpreted privately. They were reported, cataloged, and discussed. The concern was not curiosity, it was urgency. Something had gone wrong between the human and divine worlds, and ignoring it risked escalation. Importantly, prodigies did not predict specific outcomes. They announced imbalance. The question was not what would happen, but what needed to be done. The response was expiation. This meant corrective action, not punishment. Sacrifices were made. Rituals were repeated or expanded. Sometimes unfamiliar rites were introduced. The goal was restoration, not explanation. These responses could feel excessive, but excess was safer than neglect. Failing to act after a prodigy was more dangerous than acting too much. Inaction suggested indifference. This mindset reinforced collective responsibility. A prodigy did not belong to the individual who witnessed it. It belonged to the community. Everyone shared the risk if balance was not restored. Even skeptics took these events seriously. You could doubt interpretation, but dismissing a prodigy outright risked social and political consequences. Leaders were expected to respond visibly. Over time, this system created a hierarchy of signs. Minor omens might unsettle a person. Harsh signs demanded action. Prodigies demanded correction. Through these practices, superstition became institutional. Fear was not allowed to remain private. It was processed publicly through ritual and repetition. The result was not constant panic, but structured response. Romans believed danger was manageable if acknowledged quickly and addressed correctly. Haruspicy, lightning, and prodigies reminded Romans that not all warnings whispered. Some announced themselves loudly, demanding attention whether one was ready or not. When certainty collapsed, Romans reached for voices that spoke in crisis. Ordinary signs were useful when life followed a familiar rhythm. Birds, chance words, and small omens helped guide daily decisions. But when that rhythm broke, through plague, famine, military disaster, or internal unrest, subtle signs felt inadequate. In moments like these, uncertainty spread faster than explanation. Romans believed the gods had to be consulted more directly, through channels reserved for extreme need. These situations were marked by repetition. One failure might be tolerated. Two, raised concern. Continued loss signaled that something deeper was wrong. At that point, ignoring the divine felt irresponsible. Crisis superstition was not impulsive, it was escalatory. Prophecy in Rome was never casual. It was controlled, guarded, and treated as dangerous if mishandled. Words about the future carried real power. Spoken carelessly, they could destabilize a frightened population. Spoken correctly, they could restore confidence and impose order where fear threatened to spread. At the center of this system stood sacred texts believed to contain divine instructions for moments of collapse. These writings were not consulted out of curiosity or hope. They were opened reluctantly, under strict supervision, and only after conventional remedies failed. Their authority came from restraint. What was rare was trusted. The underlying belief was simple but potent. The gods had already anticipated disaster. Guidance already existed. Human responsibility lay not in inventing solutions, but in asking properly, at the right moment, and responding without hesitation. Consultation during crisis followed a recognizable pattern. First came acknowledgement that something was wrong beyond ordinary explanation. Losses mounted. Efforts failed. Signs repeated themselves without resolution. Only when these conditions were met did authorities turn to extraordinary guidance. Jumping too quickly to prophecy risked appearing weak or panicked. This delay mattered. It preserved the sense that divine intervention was exceptional, not routine. If prophecy were invoked too often, it lost authority. Scarcity gave it weight. The gods were not to be disturbed lightly. Crises blurred boundaries that were normally rigid. Practices once criticized as excessive or foreign became acceptable. Old rituals were revived from memory. New gods were invited into the city. Ceremonies that felt strange or uncomfortable were performed precisely because discomfort signaled seriousness. Familiar solutions had failed. Unfamiliar ones were now justified. These responses were not random. Romans believed certain gods specialized in certain dangers. Disease demanded one kind of response, military defeat another. Social unrest, another still. The wrong response risked worsening the imbalance. Precision mattered. Fear played a central role, but it was not allowed to roam freely. Panic was acknowledged, then redirected. Superstition offered a framework for turning fear into action. Processions, vows, sacrifices, rather than letting it fragment households and neighborhoods. Public participation mattered deeply. Processions through the streets, collective vows, and shared observance reinforced unity. Even those who doubted the cause could recognize the effect. Ritual transformed private fear into visible stability. It reminded people they were not facing disaster alone. Rumor thrived during these moments. Stories spread quickly about visions, signs, divine anger, or whispered prophecies. Authorities worked to contain interpretation, channeling belief into approved forms. Uncontrolled prophecy was dangerous. It bypassed institutions and challenged order. This is why unofficial seers and wandering prophets were treated with suspicion. Their messages could not be regulated. Their authority came from personality rather than tradition. Even when sincere, they threatened stability by offering meaning outside official control. Yet belief in prophecy never vanished. It resurfaced whenever pressure mounted. Humans wanted reassurance that suffering was not meaningless, that someone or something understood what was happening, and that disaster followed a pattern rather than chaos. Importantly, crisis superstition was not purely emotional. It was logistical. New rules were introduced, new holidays declared, new taboos enforced. Daily life shifted in response to perceived divine instruction. Belief reshaped routine. Once the crisis passed, many of these practices faded quietly. What remained was memory, the awareness that, when pushed far enough, Rome possessed tools for speaking directly with the divine. This reinforced a broader lesson. The gods were distant, but not unreachable, silent, but not indifferent. When approached correctly, even catastrophe could receive an answer. In this way, superstition functioned as an emergency system, activated rarely, taken seriously always, and remembered long after danger receded. The dead did not always stay quiet. Romans believed death ended a life, not a presence. The boundary between the living and the dead existed, but it was thin, permeable, and uneven. Certain places felt closer to it than others. Crossroads, Graveyards, doorways, and neglected ground. Certain times felt riskier as well, especially night, when visibility dropped and imagination filled the gaps. Most of the dead were not feared. They were expected to remain calm, distant, and properly settled. Trouble began when that settlement failed. Proper burial mattered deeply. It was not only a social duty or an act of respect, but a spiritual necessity. Without correct rites, the dead were thought to linger, restless and unresolved, unable to join the wider community of ancestors. This belief shaped everything from funeral customs to inheritance law. A body left unburied was not just a tragedy, it was an open problem that could spread beyond the individual. Romans spoke of the manes as the collective spirits of the dead. They were not individual ghosts haunting specific corners, but a broader category of ancestral presence. When honored, they were benevolent and distant, content to receive remembrance rather than attention. When neglected, they became unpredictable. Memory and maintenance kept them peaceful, forgetting invited disturbance. The home played a role even after death. Ancestors were not banished from family life. They were acknowledged regularly, fed symbolically, and remembered on specific days woven into the calendar. These acts were not emotional indulgences. They were preventative measures. A remembered dead relative was less likely to become restless. Neglect suggested abandonment. Night altered perception and belief alike. Sounds carried farther. Shadows shifted without explanation. Ordinary creaks felt intentional rather than accidental. Romans believed darkness weakened boundaries that daylight reinforced. Activities slowed. Lamps burned longer than necessary. People avoided unnecessary movement after sunset, not out of panic, but caution. Night demanded restraint. Some spirits were believed to wander. These were not honored ancestors, but unsettled presences, those who died violently, prematurely, or without rites. They were thought to hover near the living, drawn by confusion, anger, or unfinished obligation. These spirits did not announce themselves dramatically. Their presence was subtle, felt more than seen. Stories about them circulated quietly, reinforcing careful behavior rather than fear. The emotion attached to these beliefs was not constant terror, it was vigilance. If a door creaked without wind, one listened. If something fell without explanation, one paused. If a sound repeated itself, attention sharpened. Ignoring such moments felt careless, as if one were inviting escalation. Certain nights were considered especially vulnerable. On these occasions, the living accepted responsibility for reinforcing boundaries. Ritual actions were performed to push unsettled presences back into their proper place. These acts were not improvised. They followed remembered patterns, passed down through households and generations. During these observances, the head of household moved deliberately through the home after dark, performing symbolic gestures meant to expel unwanted presence. The actions were quiet, controlled, and exact. Repetition mattered. Precision mattered. Sloppiness invited failure, not because the ritual was fragile, but because carelessness signaled disrespect. Offerings were made not to attract the dead, but to satisfy them from a distance. Objects were placed, words were spoken carefully, and silence followed. The goal was not conversation or reassurance, it was closure. The living did not seek answers from the dead, they sought separation. Other occasions focused on remembrance rather than expulsion. Families visited graves together. Food was shared symbolically. The living acknowledged the dead as part of the household's extended structure. These moments reinforced continuity rather than fear, reminding families that death did not erase belonging. Children learned these rhythms early, long before they understood their meaning. They absorbed which days felt different, which nights were quieter, which spaces deserved respect. Ghost belief was not taught through frightening stories, but routine. Repetition made it normal. Stories about hauntings circulated without embellishment. A presence felt, a sound that returned, a place quietly avoided. These stories rarely ended dramatically. Their purpose was instruction, not entertainment. They taught where not to linger and when to pay attention. Importantly, Romans did not see ghosts as monsters. They were disruptions of order, evidence that something had been neglected, forgotten, or done incorrectly. The solution was almost always corrective rather than violent. Fix the mistake, restore balance, and the disturbance would fade. This belief reinforced moral responsibility across generations. Care for the dead reflected care for the living. Neglect carried consequences beyond memory, extending into daily safety and peace of mind. The dead, in Roman thought, demanded attention, but not obsession. When honored correctly, they receded into the background of life. When ignored, they returned to remind the living of unfinished duty. Superstition, in this space, provided rules for coexistence. Live attentively, remember properly, maintain boundaries, and never assume that silence means absence. Some beliefs were never spoken aloud in polite company. Romans understood that not all supernatural forces were neutral or protective. Alongside household rites, omens, and careful remembrance existed practices meant to harm, restrain, or compel. These practices were not part of public religion or official ritual. They belonged to the margins of society, where desperation, rivalry, secrecy, and imbalance gathered. They were known, feared, and quietly acknowledged, even when openly denied. Curses were not theatrical fantasies or wild superstition. They were practical tools for people who felt cornered. When legal systems failed to deliver justice, when rivals could not be confronted openly, when love, status, or money slipped beyond reach, some Romans turned to binding magic. The act itself was rarely emotional. It was quiet, deliberate, and hidden, carried out with careful attention rather than passion. The most common physical form of these practices was the curse tablet. Thin sheets of lead were inscribed with names, requests, and instructions. Lead mattered deeply. It was heavy, cold, dull, and resistant to decay. Romans associated it with the underworld and with forces that dragged downward rather than lifting upward. Words scratched into it were meant to sink, not rise, carrying intention into darker spaces. These tablets rarely asked for dramatic destruction or sudden death. Instead, they focused on restriction and interference. Silence an opponent in court, confuse a rival's thoughts, weaken the hands, voice, or confidence of a competitor. The aim was not spectacle, but obstruction. Success meant delay, failure, or loss of control rather than visible catastrophe. Once prepared, the tablet had to be placed correctly. Location mattered as much as language. Many were deposited in graves, wells, bathhouses, or sanctuaries associated with chthonic forces. These locations were chosen because they were believed to connect directly to the underworld or to restless spirits willing to act. The intention was not to attract attention from the gods of the sky, but from powers closer to death, decay, and unresolved obligation. The language used on these tablets was precise, formal, and repetitive. Names were listed carefully, sometimes multiple times, to prevent ambiguity. Family relationships, occupations, and identifying details were spelled out to avoid error. The tablet functioned like a contract. It bound the target through wording, structure, and repetition rather than emotional force. This practice existed alongside a constant fear of being cursed. Misfortune did not always feel random. Repeated losses, sudden illness, unexplained accidents, or professional failure might be interpreted as external interference. The question was not always who was responsible, but how the influence might be neutralized or redirected. Protective responses followed naturally. Charms were worn more carefully and more frequently. Behavior became restrained. Speech was guarded. Suspicion sharpened. Silence replaced boasting. Personal information was shared cautiously. These reactions mattered as much as the belief itself. Superstition shaped conduct even in the absence of proof. Roman authorities were deeply uneasy with these practices. They blurred boundaries between religion, superstition, and crime. In public, magic was condemned. In law, it was inconsistently prosecuted. In private, it was feared. Enforcement varied by time, place, and political convenience. What mattered most was control, not purity. Love was one of the strongest motivations for curse and binding magic. Attraction, rejection, jealousy, and obsession pushed people toward measures they would otherwise dismiss as extreme. Love spells aimed to confuse, inflame, dominate, or immobilize. Success was not measured in mutual affection, but in fixation and loss of agency. Sport, gambling, and entertainment were not immune. Competitive environments bred desperation. Victories brought prestige. Losses carried humiliation. In these spaces, curses promised advantage when skill, training, or luck felt insufficient. The pressure to win made moral boundaries flexible. Importantly, most Romans who turned to these practices did not see themselves as practitioners of dark arts. They did not believe they were acting outside society. They believed they were correcting imbalance. When the world felt unfair or stacked against them, magic offered a method of response when other options were closed. The fear surrounding curses reinforced social caution. Trust was limited. Friendships were navigated carefully. Private objects were protected. Even admiration carried risk if envy followed it. Superstition shaped relationships as much as it shaped belief. These practices reveal the darker edge of Roman superstition. Belief did not always comfort or stabilize. Sometimes it escalated conflict, deepened suspicion, and justified harm carried out quietly and indirectly. Yet even here, structure existed. Words mattered. Placement mattered. Timing mattered. Intent mattered. Chaos was not embraced. It was disciplined. In this hidden world, superstition did not soothe anxiety. It sharpened it, focused it, and turned it into a tool. Uncertainty followed Romans everywhere. Daily life exposed them to risks they could not fully control. Illness arrived without warning. Childbirth carried danger. Travel was unpredictable. Work depended on weather, markets, and the favor of others. In this environment, superstition filled the gaps where knowledge ended. Medicine blended observation with belief. Treatments involved herbs, rest, and practical care, but they were rarely separated from ritual. Words were spoken while remedies were applied. Objects were placed nearby for protection. Recovery was not only physical, it was symbolic. If the gods had been offended, healing required correction as much as treatment. Certain illnesses were believed to respond better to ritual than to medicine alone. Fever, sudden weakness, or unexplained pain might prompt charms or spoken formulas. These were not substitutes for care, but additions. Ignoring either felt incomplete. Childbirth intensified superstition. Outcomes were uncertain, and loss was common. Protective objects were kept close. Words were chosen carefully. Visitors were managed. Attention was limited. The goal was to shield both mother and child from harmful influence during vulnerability. Love and desire carried their own risks. Attraction was powerful, unpredictable, and socially consequential. Superstition offered ways to manage uncertainty without confrontation. Small rituals, objects, or phrases promised reassurance when emotions felt unstable. Marriage, too, involved careful timing. Certain days felt safer. Certain actions were avoided. Beginnings mattered. Starting incorrectly could invite lasting imbalance. Work and money were constant sources of anxiety. Contracts depended on trust. Markets shifted suddenly. Gambling and trade brought both hope and risk. Romans watched for signs before committing. A bad feeling might delay a deal. A favorable sign could encourage boldness. Spilled substances, broken tools, or interrupted actions at work could unsettle confidence. How one responded mattered. Correcting the moment was as important as correcting the mistake. Travel sharpened awareness. Leaving home meant exposure. Roads were dangerous. Ships were fragile. Before departure, Romans watched and listened. A poor sign might justify delay. Ignoring it felt reckless. During journeys, unexpected encounters were interpreted carefully. Animals crossing the path, sudden noises, unplanned meetings. These moments were not dismissed lightly. They shaped decisions mid-course. Sea travel carried particular dread. Storms arrived quickly. Survival depended on forces beyond control. Sailors relied on ritual, vow, and observation to impose order on unpredictability. Even leisure was not free from belief. Games, performances, and competitions involved luck. Winning mattered socially. Losing carried embarrassment. Superstition offered explanations when outcomes felt unfair. What unified these areas was vulnerability. Superstition clustered where control weakened. It provided a sense of participation in outcomes otherwise dictated by chance. Importantly, these practices did not require full belief. Participation itself mattered. Performing the action reduced anxiety, whether or not one trusted the cause. Superstition in daily life was not dramatic. It was practical. It allowed Romans to move forward despite uncertainty, armed with habits that made risk feel manageable. In a world without guarantees, belief became routine. It was not about certainty. It was about coping. Superstition did not weaken Rome. It organized it. To modernize, Roman belief can look excessive, anxious, or irrational. But within its own world, superstition functioned as structure. It offered explanations when events felt arbitrary. It provided procedures when fear threatened paralysis. Most importantly, it created shared expectations about how uncertainty should be handled. Roman society depended on balance between humans and gods, between individuals and the state, between ambition and restraint. Superstition helped maintain that balance by setting limits. It reminded people that not everything was under human control, and that acting as if it were carried consequences. This belief system also reinforced hierarchy. Not everyone interpreted signs equally. Some voices carried authority, others followed. In public life, this allowed leaders to slow events, redirect action, or impose caution without admitting weakness. In private life, it allowed families to manage fear through routine rather than argument. Over time, superstition became embedded in habit rather than belief. A Roman did not stop to question every gesture, touching a threshold, avoiding certain words, delaying action after a bad sign. These actions felt natural. They were part of being careful, not being fearful. Importantly, superstition offered continuity across change. Rome transformed dramatically across centuries. Kings fell. Republic became empire. Laws shifted. Borders expanded. Yet daily practices persisted. The same gestures, charms, and cautions followed Romans into new eras and distant provinces. This persistence made superstition resilient. It adapted without disappearing. New gods were added. New rituals layered onto old ones. The system expanded rather than collapsed. There were costs. Excessive fear could stall progress. Signs could be manipulated. Anxiety could spread. But Romans understood these risks. Debate about superstition existed within Rome itself. Skeptics criticized excess without rejecting the framework entirely. What endured was not blind belief, but usefulness. Superstition worked because it gave people something to do when control slipped away. It replaced helplessness with action, even if symbolic. In times of peace, superstition faded into background habit. In times of crisis, it surged forward, shaping responses and restoring order. This flexibility kept it relevant. The Roman world was not governed by certainty. It was governed by attention, watching the sky, listening to words, noticing timing, adjusting behavior accordingly. This attentiveness created a culture that was cautious, but resilient. Romans expected misfortune. They prepared for it. And when it arrived, they believed it could be answered. Superstition, then, was not the opposite of reason. It was Rome's method for living with uncertainty before certainty was possible. Even as beliefs changed and old practices faded, the instinct remained. To look for meaning, to correct imbalance, to act carefully when the world felt unstable. That instinct held Rome together, not because it eliminated fear, but because it taught Romans how to live alongside it. If this exploration of Roman belief helped you settle into a calmer rhythm, consider supporting the channel. A simple like, subscribe, or quiet return for another story helps keep these histories alive. Until next time, rest well.